Hi, I'm Sophia Rivera. I thought being the responsible daughter meant protection, stability, and eventually recognition for holding our family together. Instead, at 17, I was working 60-hour weeks, while my 15-year-old sister Isabella got a $200 weekly allowance for existing. The breaking point wasn't when I collapsed from exhaustion at my second job, or when Isabella bought her third designer purse that month while I wore the same torn sneakers for 8 months straight. It was the moment I realized my parents had been collecting unemployment benefits for 2 years while forcing me to fund their lifestyle. And when I finally fought back, they tried to have me arrested for theft. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Pennsylvania autumn had painted Millbrook in shades of copper and gold, the kind of small-town beauty that made tourists stop for pictures but couldn't mask the rot underneath. I pulled into the gravel driveway of our 2-story colonial on Maple Street, the engine of my beaten Honda Civic coughing like an old man with emphysema. The dashboard clock glowed an angry red 11:47 p.m. Another 16-hour day behind me, flour still caked under my fingernails from the early morning shift at Sunrise Bakery, followed by 8 hours of landscaping work that left my shoulders screaming and my back feeling like someone had taken a sledgehammer to my spine. The porch light flickered weakly, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that made the peeling paint look even more pathetic than usual. Through the living room window, I could see the blue wash of television light dancing across the wall. My parents were exactly where I expected them to be, exactly where they'd been every night for the past 2 years since Dad Marcus got laid off from the construction company, and Mom Catherine suddenly developed mysterious back problems that prevented her from working at the dental office. Convenient how those back problems never seemed to interfere with her daily shopping trips to Westfield Mall, or her twice-weekly spa appointments. I sat in the car for a moment longer than necessary, feeling the October chill seep through the thin fabric of my work jacket. The silence was deceptive, almost peaceful, like the calm before a tornado rips through everything you thought was solid. My phone buzzed against my leg, probably another text from my supervisor at Greenspace Property Management asking if I could pick up extra hours tomorrow. The answer was always yes. It had to be. As I stepped out of the car, my legs nearly buckled beneath me. 17 years old, and I felt ancient, like I was carrying the weight of 3 people on my back because honestly I was. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound cutting through the house like a knife. The familiar smell hit me immediately, a mixture of takeout containers, stale cigarette smoke, and that particular scent of people who'd given up on themselves. Isabella lounged across the leather sectional that I'd worked overtime to help pay for, her freshly manicured nails tapping against the screen of her brand-new iPhone. She didn't look up when I walked in, too absorbed in whatever TikTok video was holding her attention. Her shopping bags from today's mall expedition were scattered across the coffee table like trophies. Sephora, Urban Outfitters, Lululemon. Each bag probably cost more than what I made in a day of breaking my back in someone else's garden. "You're late," Marcus called from his recliner without taking his eyes off the television. His voice carried that particular tone he'd perfected over the years, the one that managed to sound both bored and accusatory at the same time. A fresh beer can sat sweating on the side table next to him, probably his 4th or 5th of the evening. The unemployment checks might not have been enough to maintain their previous lifestyle, but they were apparently sufficient to keep him in Budweiser and cable television. "Sorry," I mumbled, not because I meant it, but because arguing would take energy I didn't have. I'd learned long ago that explanations were pointless. Telling them about the emergency landscaping job that ran 3 hours late because Miss Henderson needed her entire backyard resodded before her daughter's wedding this weekend would only earn me a lecture about time management from people who hadn't managed to be anywhere on time in years. Catherine appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, wearing the expensive loungewear set that Isabella had surprised her with last week. Her hair was perfectly styled despite spending the entire day at home, and her makeup was flawless. Apparently, collecting government assistance required a full beauty routine. "Sophia, honey, we need to talk," she said, her voice dripping with that fake sweetness that always preceded a request for money. "Isabella needs new dance shoes for her classes at Millbrook Dance Academy, and the tuition payment is due next week." I stared at her for a moment, feeling something cold and sharp settle in my chest. Isabella's dance classes cost more per month than most people paid in rent. The same Isabella who was currently scrolling through social media on a phone that cost more than my car was wearing workout clothes that I couldn't afford even with my employee discount at the athletic store where I'd briefly worked a third job before my body started shutting down from exhaustion. How much? I asked, though I already knew the answer would be more than I had. Just $300 for the shoes and the tuition is $850, Catherine said casually, as if she was asking me to pick up milk from the store. Oh, and Isabella wants to go to that new boutique downtown tomorrow. She needs a dress for homecoming. I looked over at Isabella, who finally glanced up from her phone long enough to shrug. All my friends are getting new dresses, she said, as if that explained everything. I can't be the only one wearing something old. The old something she was referring to was probably the dress hanging in her closet with the tags still on it, the one I'd helped pay for 2 months ago for some other event that had apparently been forgotten in favor of this new crisis. Isabella's closet was a graveyard of barely worn clothes, each piece representing hours of my life I'd never get back. Marcus finally looked away from the television, fixing me with that stare I'd come to dread. We're family, Sophia. This is what families do for each other. The hypocrisy was so thick I could have choked on it. What families do for each other. I wanted to laugh, or scream, or maybe both. When was the last time anyone in this family had done something for me? When was the last time someone had asked how I was holding up or if I needed anything? Or if maybe I wanted to go shopping for something frivolous and unnecessary? I don't have $800 right now, I said carefully. I just paid the electric bill and the grocery shopping, and my car needs new brakes. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus's jaw tightened, and Catherine's fake smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. You don't have it right now, or you don't want to help your sister? Catherine asked, her voice taking on that particular edge that meant I was about to be subjected to another lecture about family loyalty and responsibility. I literally don't have it, I repeated, exhaustion making my voice flatter than I intended. I can probably manage the dance shoes by next Friday, but the tuition and the dress money isn't happening this week. Isabella rolled her eyes dramatically, huffing like I'd personally ruined her entire existence. God, Sophia, it's not like we're asking for a kidney, it's just money, as if money was something that grew on trees in our backyard. As if it wasn't something I bled for every single day while she spent her afternoons at the mall and her evenings sprawled across furniture I'd helped buy. Just money that I earned by getting up at 4:30 every morning to prep dough and frost cupcakes, by spending my weekends on my hands and knees planting flowers for people who lived in houses I'd never be able to afford. Maybe if you got a job, I started, but Marcus cut me off with a sharp laugh. Isabella's job is school, he said firmly. She's maintaining a 3.8 GPA, she's involved in dance, she's got a social life. That's what teenagers are supposed to be doing. I stared at him, feeling something bitter and cold spreading through my chest. Apparently I wasn't a teenager. Apparently at 17 I was already an adult with adult responsibilities and adult expectations, while my 15-year-old sister got to live the carefree adolescence that I'd never been allowed to have. I was getting good grades too, I said quietly, before I had to drop out to work full-time. The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine shifted uncomfortably, and even Isabella looked up from her phone for a moment. It was true, and we all knew it. I'd been on track to graduate early, had been accepted to 3 different colleges with partial scholarships. All of that had evaporated the moment my parents decided that my education was less important than maintaining their lifestyle. That was a difficult decision for all of us, Catherine said finally, her voice defensive. But someone had to step up when your father lost his job. Step up, as if I'd volunteered for this life, as if I'd raised my hand and eagerly offered to sacrifice my future for their comfort, as if I hadn't fought and argued and pleaded to be allowed to finish school, only to be told over and over again that family came first, that this was temporary, that things would go back to normal soon. 2 years later, I was still waiting for normal. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, fixing me with that look that had made me feel small and guilty for most of my life. Your sister deserves to have the same opportunities that other kids her age have: dance classes, nice clothes, social activity. We're not going to let her suffer just because times are tough, The irony wasn't lost on me. Isabella wouldn't suffer, but apparently, my suffering was not only acceptable, but expected. She got to be a normal teenager while I worked myself into the ground to fund her normal teenage experience. She got to worry about homecoming dresses, while I worried about whether I could afford to fix my car brakes before they gave out completely. "I'll see what I can do," I said finally, because arguing was pointless, and I was too tired to fight a battle I'd never win anyway. Isabella brightened immediately, her attention already drifting back to her phone. The crisis had been solved, at least from her perspective. Someone else would handle the money, someone else would figure out how to make it work, someone else would sacrifice whatever was necessary to maintain her comfort. Catherine smiled, that satisfied smile that meant she'd gotten what she wanted. "I knew we could count on you, hun. You're such a responsible girl." Responsible. The word felt like a weight settling on my shoulders, heavier than all the landscaping equipment I'd hauled around today. I was responsible for everything except my own life, responsible for everyone except myself. As I headed toward the stairs, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from my friend Zoe Parker, who was probably the only person in my life who understood how exhausted I was. "Movie tomorrow night?" the message read. "I'll buy the popcorn." I stared at the text for a long moment, trying to remember the last time I'd done something just for fun, the last time I'd sat in a movie theater and forgotten about bills and jobs and family obligations for 2 hours. It felt like a lifetime ago. "Can't," I typed back. "Need to pick up extra shifts." The 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, her response came through. "When was the last time you did something for yourself?" I didn't answer because I couldn't remember. Upstairs in my room, I sat on the edge of my bed and pulled off my work boots, wincing as my feet protested. My room was the smallest in the house, barely big enough for a twin bed and a small dresser, but it was mine. The walls were still painted the pale yellow I'd chosen when I was 12, back when I'd believed that working hard and being good would eventually be rewarded, back when I'd thought that sacrifice was temporary and fairness was guaranteed. My laptop sat on the small desk by the window, probably the most expensive thing I owned besides my car. I'd saved for 8 months to buy it, planning to use it for college applications and online classes. Now it mostly served as a way to apply for additional jobs and manage the family's finances, since apparently I was the only one capable of keeping track of when bills were due. I opened the banking app on my phone and stared at my account balance. After paying for groceries, the electric bill and gas for my car, I had exactly $237 to last until my next payday. The dance shoes would wipe out most of that, leaving me with barely enough to cover my own expenses. The tuition money would have to come from somewhere else, probably my emergency fund, that was supposed to be for car repairs or medical emergencies. But looking at those numbers on my phone screen, something shifted inside me. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was the conversation downstairs, or maybe it was just the accumulation of 2 years of feeling like a ghost in my own life. For the first time in a long time, I started asking myself questions I'd been too afraid to consider. Why was I the only one working? Why was I the only one sacrificing? Why was Isabella's comfort more important than my survival? I pulled up another app on my phone, one I'd downloaded months ago but never had the courage to use, the Pennsylvania Department of Labor website. My fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before I typed in my father's name and social security number. The information was all there in our joint filing cabinet downstairs, along with all the other family paperwork I'd been managing since I was 15. What I found made my stomach drop. Marcus Rivera had been receiving unemployment benefits for 26 months, not just the standard benefits, but extended benefits, emergency pandemic assistance, and several other programs I didn't even recognize. The total amount was staggering, more than I made in 6 months of working 2 jobs. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the employment status listed on his profile, actively seeking employment. According to the state of Pennsylvania, my father had been diligently looking for work for over 2 years, attending job interviews, and submitting applications, and doing everything a responsible unemployed person was supposed to do. I thought about every single day of the past 2 years. Marcus sitting in his recliner watching television and drinking beer. Marcus sleeping until noon, while I left for my first job before dawn. Mark is complaining about having to drive Isabella to dance class because it interfered with his afternoon nap schedule. When exactly was he doing all this active job searching? I pulled up my mother's information next, my hands shaking slightly as I navigated to the disability benefits website. Catherine Rivera had been receiving disability payments for 24 months due to a back injury that prevented her from performing her duties as a dental hygienist. I thought about Catherine's spa appointments, her shopping trips, her perfectly styled hair and flawless makeup. I thought about last weekend when she'd spent 4 hours rearranging the living room furniture, moving the heavy sectional and coffee table around like they were made of paper. My phone slipped from my hands and clattered onto the hardwood floor. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet house, but no one came to check if I was okay. No one ever came to check if I was okay. For 2 years I had been funding a lifestyle for people who were perfectly capable of funding it themselves. For 2 years I had been working myself into the ground while my parents collected government assistance and pretended to be unable to work. For 2 years I had been the only honest person in a house full of fraud. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs and making my vision blur at the edges. I pressed my hands against my chest, trying to steady my breathing, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. They weren't just lazy, they weren't just taking advantage of me, they were criminals, and I had been unknowingly funding their criminal enterprise while destroying my own life in the process. I picked up my phone from the floor and stared at the government website still open on my browser. The evidence was all there, documented and official and undeniable. My parents had been committing fraud for 2 years while forcing me to work myself into exhaustion to support them. But more than that, they had stolen my life. They had stolen my education, my teenage years, my chance at a normal future. They had stolen my health and my happiness and my hope, all while collecting money they had no legal right to receive. Something cold and sharp crystallized in my chest, something that felt like anger but deeper, more permanent. For 2 years I had been a victim. I had been manipulated and exploited and gaslit into believing that this was normal, that this was what family meant, that this was what love looked like. But sitting there on my bed, staring at the proof of their deception, I realized something that would change everything. I didn't have to be a victim anymore. I had evidence. I had documentation. I had the power to stop this. And for the first time in 2 years I started planning for a future where I wasn't funding someone else's lies. Sleep came in fragments that night, broken by dreams of government forms and bank statements that morphed into monsters chasing me through endless hallways. I woke before my alarm, the October dawn filtering through my thin curtains like weak tea. My body ached in places I didn't know could ache, but my mind was clearer than it had been in months. The fog of exhaustion that usually clouded my thoughts had been burned away by the white-hot clarity of the trail. I dressed quietly in my Sunrise Bakery uniform, the polyester fabric scratchy against my skin. Downstairs the house was tomb silent. No sounds of movement, no television murmur, no signs that anyone else in this family had any intention of greeting the day before noon. I grabbed my keys and slipped out the front door, the October air biting at my exposed skin. The drive to the bakery took me through the heart of Millbrook, past the shuttered storefronts and the handful of businesses that managed to stay afloat in our dying town. At 5:30 in the morning, Oakwood Drive was empty except for a few delivery trucks and the occasional early commuter heading toward the highway that would take them to jobs in Pittsburgh or Harrisburg. Places where people made real money, where 17-year-olds didn't have to choose between their education and their family's electric bill. Mrs. Kowalski was already at the bakery when I arrived, her silver hair pinned back in a hairnet, flour dusting her apron like snow. She'd owned Sunrise Bakery for 30 years, had hired me when I was desperate and green and willing to work for minimum wage. She was kind in the way that small-town business owners could be when they found good help, but she was also practical. She knew I needed this job more than she needed me, and that knowledge colored every interaction we had. "You look tired, honey," she said as I tied my apron strings. "Everything okay at home?" The question hung in the air between us, weighted with the kind of concern that demanded either a lie or an explanation I wasn't ready to give. Mrs. Kowalski had known my family for years, had probably sold my parents' wedding cake decades ago. In a town like Millbrook, everyone's business was everyone's business. which meant that telling the truth about what I'd discovered would spread through the community like wildfire. Just a long week, I said, which wasn't technically a lie but wasn't the truth either. It had been a long 2 years. We worked in comfortable silence for the first hour, the rhythm of measuring and mixing, as familiar as breathing. My hands moved automatically through the motions of preparing the day's inventory while my mind wandered through the implications of what I'd learned. 2 years of government assistance, while I worked myself into the ground to supplement their illegal income. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. But it was a cold anger now, sharp and focused rather than the hot, desperate rage I'd felt in my bedroom. By 7 o'clock, the bakery was ready for the morning rush, such as it was in Millbrook. The bell above the door chimed as our first customers trickled in, construction workers grabbing coffee and donuts before their shifts, office workers from the few businesses that hadn't closed down, retirees who came in for the social interaction as much as the fresh bread. It was during the mid-morning lull that my phone buzzed with a text from Isabella. "Dad says you need to stop at the bank after work today. The dance studio called about payment." I stared at the message, feeling that familiar knot of resentment tighten in my stomach. No please, no thank you, just an expectation that I would drop everything to handle yet another expense for Isabella's endless activities. I typed back a simple "can't today" and put my phone away. 5 minutes later my phone rang. "Marcus, Sophia, what do you mean you can't go to the bank today? Isabella needs that tuition paid." I glanced around the bakery, grateful that Mrs. Kowalski was in the back room, and the front was empty. "I have to work a double shift today, and then I have landscaping until 8. The bank will be closed, then go during your lunch break." "I don't get a lunch break." The pause on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had that edge that meant he was running out of patience. "Sophia, this is important. Isabella's dance classes aren't just some hobby, they're an investment in her future. You know how talented she is." I almost laughed. Isabella was mediocre at best, middle of the pack in a dance studio that accepted anyone whose parents could pay the fee. But she enjoyed it, and more importantly, it kept her busy and out of the house, which seemed to be worth any amount of money to my parents. "The payment can wait until tomorrow," I said. "No, it can't. They're threatening to drop her from the advanced class if we don't pay today." Advanced class. Isabella had been in the same advanced class for 8 months, never progressing to anything that actually resembled advanced technique. But the advanced class cost twice as much as the regular classes, which was probably the real reason the studio was so eager to keep their students enrolled. "I'll handle it tomorrow," I repeated, my voice firmer this time. Marcus's response was immediate and sharp. "You'll handle it today, or you'll explain to your sister why she's being humiliated in front of her friends." The line went dead. I stared at my phone for a moment, feeling that familiar cocktail of guilt and resentment swirling in my chest. This was how it always went. Some crisis involving Isabella's activities, demands for immediate payment, and the implicit threat that I was personally responsible for her happiness and social standing. But today felt different. Today I knew exactly how much money my parents were collecting from the government, while demanding that I fund Isabella's extracurricular activities. Today I had numbers and documentation and proof that this whole situation was built on a foundation of lies. The bell chimed again and I looked up to see Zoe Parker pushing through the door, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun and her scrubs rumpled from what had probably been a long night shift at the hospital where she worked as a nursing assistant. Zoe was 21, had been my closest friend since high school, and was one of the few people who understood what it was like to work too much and worry about money constantly. "Please tell me you have coffee that's stronger than what they serve at the hospital," she said, collapsing dramatically against the counter. I poured her a large cup of our darkest roast and added an extra shot of espresso without being asked. Emergency surgery that ran until 4 in the morning, and I have to be back at 6 tonight." She took a sip of coffee and closed her eyes like she was receiving a religious experience. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to have a normal job with normal hours." "I wouldn't know," I said, wiping down the counter that was already clean. "I don't think I've worked normal hours since I was 15. Zoe opened her eyes and studied my face with the kind of intensity that came from working in healthcare.
where reading people's conditions could be a matter of life and death. You look terrible, and I mean that in the most loving way possible. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Catherine, her voice syrupy sweet with fake concern when I answered. Sophia, honey, your father says you're being difficult about Isabella's dance payment. You know how important this is to her. I felt something snap inside me, a tension that had been building for 2 years finally reaching its breaking point. Important enough for you to get a job and pay for it yourself. The silence on the other end was deafening. Catherine's intake of breath was sharp and audible. Excuse me, I said, maybe you should get a job and pay for Isabella's activities yourself instead of expecting me to fund them with money I earn from working 16-hour days. Sophia Marie Rivera, I don't know what's gotten into you, but this attitude is completely unacceptable. I can't work with my back condition. You know that. The back condition that didn't prevent her from rearranging furniture or spending hours at the mall. The back condition that had coincidentally developed right around the time she decided she didn't want to work anymore. Right, your back condition, I said, my voice flat. And Dad's been actively looking for work this whole time. Another pause, longer this time. When Catherine spoke again, her voice had lost its sweet tone and taken on something harder, more desperate. Your father is doing everything he can to find employment. The job market is terrible right now, terrible enough that he's had to collect unemployment for over 2 years. I hadn't meant to say it, hadn't planned to reveal what I knew so soon, but the words were out there now, hanging in the air between us like a confession. How do you know about? Catherine started, then stopped herself. We don't discuss our private financial matters with you for a reason, young lady. Your private financial matters that I've been supplementing with my public labor for 2 years. Zoe was staring at me now, her coffee forgotten, her expression shifting from concern to something that looked like understanding.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She'd always suspected that something wasn't right about my family situation, but this was the first time I'd ever voiced it out loud. We'll discuss this when you get home, Catherine said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. And you will stop at the bank today. No, I said, the word coming out stronger and clearer than I'd expected. I won't. I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking slightly as I set the phone down on the counter. Zoe reached across and covered my hand with hers. How long? She asked quietly. 2 years. Maybe longer, I don't know when it started. The unemployment? I nodded, not trusting my voice. Saying it out loud made it real in a way that discovering it on my phone hadn't. This wasn't just something I suspected or worried about. This was fact, documented and provable, and completely illegal. Jesus. Sophia. Zoe squeezed my hand. What are you going to do? I looked around the bakery, at the cases full of pastries I'd helped make, at the coffee machine I'd learned to operate, at the cash register, where I'd counted out change for customers who didn't know that every dollar I earned was spoken for before I even received it. This place had been my sanctuary for 2 years, the one space where I was valued for my work rather than exploited for it. But it wasn't enough anymore. Working myself to death to fund my parents' fraud wasn't sustainable, and it wasn't fair, and it sure as hell wasn't legal. I'm going to stop enabling them, I said finally. Zoe raised an eyebrow. What does that look like exactly? I thought about it for a moment, the plan forming in my mind like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Isabella wants to be supported like an adult. New clothes, expensive activities, no responsibilities. Maybe it's time she learned what adult support actually costs. And your parents? Maybe it's time they learned what happens when their free labor disappears. The bell chimed again, and Mrs. Kowalski emerged from the back room, carrying a tray of fresh dinner rolls. She took one look at my face, and Zoe's concerned expression, and set the tray down with more force than necessary. Everything all right out here? Family drama, Zoe said, diplomatically. Mrs. Kowalski snorted. In my experience, family drama usually means someone's not pulling their weight. Am I right, Sophia? I met her eyes, seeing sympathy there but also a kind of knowing that made me wonder how much she'd observed over the past 2 years. Small-town business owners heard a lot of conversations, saw a lot of patterns, understood more than people gave them credit for. Something like that. I said, "Well, if you need extra shifts or if you want to pick up some catering work, I've got plenty to keep you busy. Miss Henderson wants me to do the desserts for her daughter's wedding reception next weekend." The offer was generous, and I knew it came from genuine concern rather than just business need. But the idea of working even more hours to fund even more of my family's expenses made my stomach turn. "Actually, Mrs. Kowalski, I was wondering if you could hold my next paycheck instead of giving it to me directly." She frowned. "Hold it? What for?" "I need to make sure it goes towards something specific, instead of getting absorbed into general family expense." Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed quickly by something that looked like anger. Mrs. Kowalski had raised 3 kids as a single mother while building her business from nothing. She understood the difference between family support and family exploitation. "I can do that," she said quietly. "Do you need me to do anything else? Call anyone. Or say." "Not yet," I said, "but maybe soon." After Zoe left and the lunch rush died down, I found myself with time to think. The afternoon stretched ahead of me, followed by 8 hours of landscaping work that would leave me exhausted and sore. Tomorrow would bring another early morning at the bakery, another day of demanding customers and aching feet, and the constant worry about money. But for the first time in 2 years, I wasn't just enduring it, I was planning. My phone buzzed with text after text throughout the afternoon. Isabella complaining that the dance studio had called about payment. Marcus demanding that I stop being dramatic and handle my responsibilities. Catherine alternating between guilt trips and veiled threats about family loyalty and respect. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I spent my break researching. I looked up the penalties for unemployment fraud in Pennsylvania, the process for reporting disability fraud, the resources available for people in my situation. I learned about anonymous tip lines and documentation requirements, and the difference between civil and criminal charges. By the time Mrs. Kowalski locked up the bakery at 3 o'clock, I had a plan. The landscaping job that afternoon was at the Henderson house. The same Miss Henderson who was getting married this weekend. The property was sprawling and well-maintained, the kind of place that required a full-time groundskeeping staff to look perfect year-round. I spent 4 hours planting seasonal flowers and trimming hedges, my hands working automatically while my mind churned through the details of what I'd discovered. Miss Henderson was the type of client who paid well but expected perfection, the kind of wealthy woman who'd never had to worry about money, but somehow felt entitled to judge people who did. She watched me work from her kitchen window, occasionally coming outside to point out a spot I'd missed or to suggest a different arrangement for the flower bed. "You're very dedicated," she said during one of these inspections, her tone suggesting that dedication was somehow surprising in someone like me. "Most young people your age don't have much work ethic." I thought about Isabella, probably at the mall right now spending money she hadn't earned on clothes she didn't need. I thought about my parents, probably at home watching television and drinking beer while collecting government checks for disabilities and unemployment they didn't qualify for. "Some of us don't have a choice," I said. Mrs. Henderson frowned slightly, as if the idea that someone might work out of necessity rather than character building was foreign to her. "Well, it's building character, I'm sure." Character, as if struggling to survive was some kind of moral improvement program rather than the result of systemic exploitation. As if my exhaustion and stress were somehow making me a better person rather than slowly destroying my health and my future. "I'm sure it is," I replied, because arguing with clients was bad for business and I couldn't afford to lose this job. But as I drove home that evening, Mrs. Henderson's words echoed in my head. Character. What kind of character was I building by enabling fraud? What kind of person was I becoming by allowing myself to be exploited while my family lived off illegal government assistance? The house was blazing with lights when I pulled into the driveway, every window glowing against the October darkness. Inside I could hear the television at full volume, probably some reality show that Isabella had demanded to watch. The electric bill for this month was going to be astronomical, and guess who would be expected to cover the difference when the unemployment and disability checks didn't stretch far enough. But as I sat in my car looking at that house, at the warm light spilling across the lawn and the comfortable life being lived inside, I realized something that changed everything. I didn't have to guess anymore. I knew exactly where their money was coming from, and I knew exactly what I was going to do about it. Isabella met me at the door, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. The dance studio called Mom and said I'm suspended from classes until the payment is made. Do you know how humiliating that is? I looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the designer clothes and the professional manicure and the makeup that cost more than I spent on food in a week. She was beautiful and spoiled and completely oblivious to the fact that her lifestyle was built on fraud and exploitation. I imagine it's about as humiliating as working 2 jobs at 17 while your parents collect government assistance. They're not entitled to, I said. Isabella's mouth fell open. What are you talking about? Ask Dad about his active job search. Ask Mom about her back injury that doesn't prevent her from rearranging furniture or shopping for 8 hours at a time. I pushed past her into the house, where Marcus and Catherine were waiting in the living room like a tribunal prepared to render judgment. Their faces were set in identical expressions of righteous anger, the kind of look that had made me feel guilty and ashamed for most of my life. But tonight, it just made me tired. We need to talk, Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority he'd never actually earned. Yes, I agreed. We do. The living room felt smaller than usual, the air thick with tension and the smell of takeout containers that nobody had bothered to clean up. Marcus sat forward in his recliner, his hands clasped together in front of him like he was about to deliver a sermon. Catherine perched on the edge of the couch, her perfectly manicured fingers worrying at the fabric of her expensive loungewear. Isabella hovered near the doorway, probably trying to decide whether to stay and watch the drama unfold or retreat to her room with her phone. Sit down, Marcus said, gesturing toward the chair across from him. I remained standing. Something about staying on my feet felt important, like sitting would put me at a disadvantage I couldn't afford. I'm fine here. Catherine's voice was carefully modulated, the tone she used when she was trying to sound reasonable while delivering an ultimatum. Sophia, we're concerned about your attitude lately. This rebellious phase needs to stop. Rebellious phase. As if questioning why I was working myself to death while they collected government benefits was teenage defiance rather than basic common sense. As if wanting to understand where my money was going was some kind of character flaw that needed to be corrected. What exactly am I rebelling against? I asked. Marcus's jaw tightened. Against your family. Against your responsibility. Against the people who raised you and loved you and gave you a home. The word home hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. This house that I helped pay for, with utilities in my name and a mortgage that came out of my bank account. This home where I was expected to work like an adult but treated like a disobedient child. This sanctuary that felt more like a prison every day. Tell me about your job search, Dad, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The change in the room was immediate and electric. Catherine went very still, her fingers freezing mid-fidget. Isabella straightened up, suddenly more interested in the conversation. Marcus's face shifted through several expressions before settling on something that was supposed to look confused but came across as guilty. What about it? How many applications have you submitted this week? I don't see how that's any of your business. When you're collecting unemployment benefits while I work 60 hours a week to support this family, it becomes my business. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant sound of traffic on Oakwood Drive, the tick of the clock that Catherine had insisted we needed for the living room, even though everyone in the house carried a phone. Catherine was the first to speak, her voice pitched higher than usual. Sophia, there are things about our financial situation that you don't understand. Adult matters that aren't your concern, like disability. Isabella gasped, a sharp intake of breath that cut through the tension like a knife. Even she understood the implications of that phrase, despite spending most of her time insulated from the real world by designer clothes and dance classes. Catherine's face went white, then flushed red. How dare you accuse me of? I'm not accusing you of anything, I interrupted. I'm stating facts. You've been collecting disability payments for a back injury that doesn't prevent you from shopping, rearranging furniture, or spending 4 hours at the spa twice a week. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair creaking in protest. That's enough. I don't know where you're getting this information, but Pennsylvania Department of Labor website, it's all public record. The look that passed between my parents was worth documenting. Pure panic, barely concealed behind weak attempts at indignation. They hadn't expected me to actually investigate. They'd assumed I was too young, too tired, too grateful for their roof over my head to question the system that was slowly killing me. You had no right to go looking into our private affairs, Catherine said, her voice shaking with what I was pretty sure was fear rather than anger. Private affairs that I've been funding for 2 years. Isabella finally found her voice. What does this mean? Are Mom and Dad in trouble? I looked at her. Really looked at her, trying to see past the perfectly styled hair and expensive makeup to the 15-year-old girl who genuinely didn't understand how the world worked. She'd been shielded from reality so completely that she probably didn't even know that unemployment benefits were supposed to be temporary, that disability payments required actual disabilities, that families weren't supposed to sacrifice one child's future to fund another child's hobbies. It means Mom and Dad have been lying, I said simply, to the government, to us, and to themselves. Marcus took a step toward me, his face dark with anger. You don't know what you're talking about. We're doing the best we can in a difficult situation. The best you can do is commit fraud while forcing your teenage daughter to work 2 jobs. We never forced you to do anything. You chose to help this family. The word chose hit me like a physical blow. Chose. As if I'd had options. As if saying no had ever been possible without threats and guilt trips and lectures about family loyalty. As if a 15-year-old girl could really choose between helping her family pay bills and being labeled selfish and ungrateful. I chose to help, I said slowly, because I believed you needed help. I chose to drop out of school because I believed this was temporary. I chose to work myself into exhaustion because I believed we were all sacrificing together. Catherine tried to interrupt, but I kept talking. But you weren't sacrificing anything. You were collecting money from the government while living off my labor. You were committing fraud while I was destroying my future to enable it. The words came faster now. 2 years of suppressed anger and resentment pouring out like water through a broken dam. Isabella gets a $200 weekly allowance while I wear the same shoes for 8 months until they have holes in them. She gets dance classes and shopping trips and new phones, while I haven't bought myself anything that wasn't absolutely necessary in 2 years. She gets to be a teenager while I work like an adult to fund her lifestyle. Isabella deserves. Marcus started. Isabella deserves exactly what she earns. I cut him off, which is nothing. She contributes nothing to this household except expense and drama, and you treat her like a princess while treating me like an employee you don't have to pay. Isabella's face crumpled, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. Sophia, that's mean. I can't help that you have to work. You can't help it, but you don't have to benefit from it either. Catherine stood up, moving to put her arm around Isabella's shoulder. Don't take your anger at us out on your sister. She's just a child. She's 15. I was working part-time jobs when I was 15. I was babysitting and mowing lawns and doing everything I could to contribute to this family when I was 15. That was different, Marcus. Isabella has other priorities. Like what? Like learning that she's entitled to things she doesn't work for. Like believing that someone else will always pay her way. Like thinking that her comfort is more important than everyone else's survival. The living room fell silent except for Isabella's quiet crying. She wasn't used to being confronted about anything. Wasn't accustomed to hearing that her lifestyle wasn't normal or sustainable or fair. For 2 years, she'd been protected from the reality of our financial situation while I bore the full weight of it. Catherine's voice was sharp when she spoke again. Even if we made mistakes with our finances, that doesn't give you the right to destroy this family. I'm not destroying anything. I'm stopping enabling. What does that mean? Marcus asked, though I could tell from his expression that he already suspected. It means I'm done. Done paying for Isabella's activities. Done covering bills that should come out of your unemployment and disability check. Done working myself to death so you can pretend to be victims while living off government assistance you're not entitled to.
The panic in Catherine's eyes was unmistakable now. Sophia, you can't just abandon your family when things get difficult. Things aren't difficult. Things are fraudulent, and I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm refusing to participate in a criminal enterprise. Isabella's crying got louder. What's going to happen to my dance classes? You'll have to get a job and pay for them yourself. Like a normal person. I can't get a job. I'm only 15. You can babysit. You can walk dogs. You can mow lawns. You can do all the things I was doing when I was your age while you were getting an allowance for existing. Marcus's voice was dangerous now. The tone he used when he was about to lose his temper completely. You will not speak to your sister that way. I'll speak to her the way someone speaks to a person who needs to understand reality. And what about us? Catherine asked. What about your parents who raised you and loved you and gave you everything? I looked around the living room, taking in the expensive furniture and the flat-screen television and the gaming console that Isabella had insisted she needed for her social life. Everything that I'd helped pay for while wearing shoes with holes in them, and eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch because I couldn't afford anything better. You gave me a roof over my head in exchange for funding your lifestyle, I said. That's not love. That's exploitation. Catherine gasped, like I'd slapped her. How can you say that? After everything we've done for you, what have you done for me? Name one thing you've done for me in the past 2 years that wasn't ultimately about benefiting yourself. The silence stretched so long that it became uncomfortable. Catherine's mouth opened and closed without sound. Marcus stared at the floor. Even Isabella stopped crying long enough to wait for an answer that never came. I thought so, I said finally. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Zoe. Everything okay? You seemed really upset earlier. I pulled out the phone and typed back. Can I stay at your place tonight? Her response was immediate. Of course. Want me to come get you? I can drive myself. Be there in an hour. I looked up to find my family staring at me with varying expressions of shock and fear. They'd finally realized that I wasn't just having a bad day or going through a phase. I was done. Where are you going? Catherine asked. Out. You can't just leave in the middle of a family discussion. This isn't a discussion. This is you trying to convince me to keep enabling your fraud while sacrificing my own future. And I'm not interested. I headed toward the stairs, intending to pack a bag and leave for Zoe's apartment. Behind me, I could hear Marcus and Catherine having a heated, whispered conversation, probably trying to figure out how to regain control of a situation that was spiraling away from them. Isabella followed me upstairs, her footsteps quick and uncertain on the carpeted steps. Sophia, wait. I turned around at the top of the stairs. Her face was blotchy from crying, her makeup smeared, her expensive clothes wrinkled from emotional distress. For a moment, she looked younger than 15, more like the little sister I remembered from before everything went wrong. Are you really going to stop helping us? She asked, her voice small and scared. I'm going to stop enabling fraud and exploitation, I said. If you want to call that stopping helping, that's your choice. But what about my dance classes? What about my allowance? I stared at her, feeling a mixture of pity and frustration. She still didn't understand. Even after everything that had been said downstairs, she was still focused on what she would lose rather than what had been wrong all along. Isabella, do you understand that most 15-year-olds don't get $200 weekly allowances? She shrugged. My friends do. Your friends' parents have jobs. Your friends' parents aren't collecting government assistance while their teenage daughters work 60 hours a week. But that's not my fault. No, it's not your fault. But it's not my responsibility either. Her face crumpled again. So you're just going to let me be humiliated at school? You're going to let everyone know that we can't afford my activities? The question revealed everything that was wrong with our family dynamic. Isabella wasn't upset about the fraud or the exploitation, or the unfairness of the situation. She was upset about the possibility of social embarrassment. She was worried about maintaining appearances, rather than addressing the fundamental problems that had created this crisis. Maybe being a little embarrassed would be good for you, I said. Maybe understanding what it's like to want things you can't afford would teach you some empathy. That's cruel. What's cruel is expecting someone else to work themselves to death so you can maintain a lifestyle you haven't earned.
I went into my room and closed the door, leaning against it for a moment to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, whether from adrenaline or anger or fear, I wasn't sure. The conversation downstairs had been 2 years in the making, and now that it was over, I felt empty and exhausted and strangely relieved. I packed quickly, throwing essentials into a duffel bag that had seen better days: clothes for work, my laptop, the folder of documents I'd been keeping that proved my financial contributions to the household. Everything else could wait. As I was zipping up the bag, I heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy ones. Marcus, a knock on my door, firm but not violent. Sophia, open up. I'm busy. We need to finish our conversation. No, we don't. The doorknob rattled. Don't make me come in there. I opened the door and faced him, my bag slung over my shoulder. He looked older than I remembered, more tired, like the stress of maintaining his lies was finally catching up with him. Where do you think you're going? He asked. To a friend's house. You live here. This is your home. This is a house where I'm expected to fund other people's fraud while sacrificing my own future. That's not a home. His face darkened. You ungrateful little. Careful, I interrupted. You might say something you can't take back. We stared at each other for a long moment, and I realized that this was probably the first time in my life that I wasn't afraid of him. Not his anger, not his disappointment, not his threats about family loyalty and responsibility. I was done being controlled by people who had never deserved that power in the first place. If you walk out that door, don't expect to come crawling back when reality hits you, he said. If I walk out that door, you'll realize how much reality costs when you have to pay for it yourself. I pushed past him and headed down the stairs, my bag bouncing against my hip with each step. In the living room, Catherine and Isabella were huddled together on the couch, both of them crying now. They looked up when I appeared, their faces hopeful and desperate. Sophia, please don't go, Catherine said. We can work this out. We can find a compromise. The compromise is that you get jobs and stop committing fraud. We can't just. Yes, you can. Dad can stop pretending to look for work and actually find employment. You can stop pretending to be disabled and go back to the dental office. Isabella can get a part-time job and start contributing to the household instead of just taking from it. Isabella's voice was barely a whisper. I don't know how to get a job. Then learn the same way I learned when I was your age. I headed toward the front door, but Catherine's voice stopped me. What about the bills? What about the mortgage? I turned around one last time, looking at the three people who had shaped my life for 17 years. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by the loss of their primary source of income and labor. For the first time in 2 years, they were going to have to figure out how to survive without exploiting me. What about them? I asked. You can't just leave us with no way to pay for anything. You have unemployment benefits, you have disability payments, you have whatever money you've been saving from not paying for your own expenses for the past 2 years. Figure it out. Marcus stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. If you walk out that door, you're no longer part of this family. The threat that had controlled me for years suddenly sounded hollow and meaningless. Being part of this family had cost me my education, my health, my future, and nearly my sanity. Being excluded from this family might be the best thing that ever happened to me. Good, I said, and walked out into the October night. The air was crisp and clean, free from the suffocating atmosphere of guilt and manipulation that had filled the house. I threw my bag into the back seat of my Honda and sat behind the wheel for a moment, looking back at the warm lights spilling from the windows. Somewhere inside, my family was probably having an emergency meeting about how to replace the income and labor they'd just lost. For the first time in 2 years, that wasn't my problem to solve. I started the car and drove toward Zoe's apartment, leaving behind the only life I'd ever known. But as I pulled onto Oakwood Drive and headed toward downtown Millbrook, I realized I wasn't leaving my life behind. I was finally starting to build one. Zoe's apartment was a converted loft above Corner Cafe, accessible through a narrow staircase that creaked with every step. The space was small but clean, with exposed brick walls and windows that looked out over downtown Millbrook's handful of surviving businesses. It felt like sanctuary after the suffocating atmosphere of Maple Street, a place where I could breathe without calculating the cost of every exhale. Zoe took one look at my face when she opened the door and pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than I'd expected. She smelled like hospital disinfectant and coffee, familiar scents that grounded me in a reality that wasn't built on lies and exploitation. "How bad was it?" she asked as I dropped my bag by the door. I told them I knew about the fraud. I told them I was done enabling it. I told Isabella she'd have to get a job if she wanted to keep her dance classes. Zoe whistled low, and they took that well, I assume. "Marcus threatened to disown me if I walked out. So you walked out." "So I walked out." She handed me a cup of tea that was already prepared, like she'd known I'd need something warm and comforting when I arrived. We sat on her second-hand couch, the springs protesting under our weight, and for the first time in hours, I felt my shoulders relax. "What's your plan?" Zoe asked. The question hung in the air between us. Plan, as if I'd thought that far ahead. As if walking out of my family's house was anything more than a desperate attempt to escape a situation that had become unbearable. "I don't know," I admitted. "I guess I'll keep working, find my own place eventually, try to figure out what normal looks like." My phone buzzed against the coffee table. A text from Catherine: "Please come home. We can discuss this like adults." I showed the message to Zoe, who snorted. "Adults don't commit fraud while forcing their children to work 60 hours a week." Another buzz, this time from Isabella. "Sophia, please come back. I'm scared." The guilt hit immediately, sharp and familiar. Isabella was just a kid, even if she was a spoiled kid who'd never learned to consider anyone but herself. She genuinely didn't understand what was happening, or why her comfortable world was suddenly falling apart. "She's manipulating you," Zoe said, reading the message over my shoulder. Classic guilt trip. Poor little sister, so scared and helpless. She is 15. You were 15 when you started working part-time jobs to help the family. 15 isn't helpless unless someone teaches you to be helpless. Before I could respond, my phone rang. "Marcus." I let it go to voicemail, but he called back immediately. Then again. On the fourth call, I finally answered. "What?" "Sophia, enough of this tantrum. Come home, right now." "No. Where are you?" "I'll come get you. I'm somewhere you can't manipulate me anymore." His voice shifted, taking on that dangerous edge that used to terrify me when I was younger. "You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you can just abandon your family and everything will work out fine. I think I can stop enabling criminals and see what happens." "Criminals?" His laugh was harsh and bitter. "We're trying to survive, Sophia. We're doing what we have to do to keep this family together. You're committing fraud while forcing me to work myself to death. That's not keeping the family together. That's destroying me to benefit yourselves. Everything we did was for this family, for you and Isabella." The lie was so blatant, so obviously false that I almost laughed. "When did anything you did benefit me? When did my welfare ever factor into your decisions? We gave you a home. I paid for that home. We fed you. I bought the groceries. We raised you. You exploited me." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet and cold. "If you don't come home tonight, there will be consequences." "What kind of consequence?" "The kind that will make you regret this decision for the rest of your life." The line went dead. I stared at my phone, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather outside. Marcus had always been good at threats, at making me believe that crossing him would result in punishment worse than whatever I was already enduring. But tonight, for the first time, his threats sounded hollow. "What did he say?" Zoe asked. "That there would be consequences if I didn't come home." "What kind of consequences could he possibly impose?" "You don't live there anymore. You're financially independent. You're 17, which means you're old enough to make your own decisions about where you live." She was right, but the fear lingered anyway. Fear was a habit I'd developed over years of walking on eggshells, of calculating every word and action to avoid triggering my parents' anger. Breaking that habit would take more than one night of rebellion. My phone buzzed with another text. This time it was from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Dylan, your cousin. Heard you're having family drama. Call me." Dylan Rivera was Marcus's nephew, 3 years older than me, and one of the few members of our extended family who'd ever seemed to understand that something wasn't right about my situation. He'd grown up in Pittsburgh, visited Millbrook only for holidays and family gatherings, but he'd always been observant. He'd asked questions that made the adults uncomfortable, made comments that suggested he saw through the carefully constructed facade my parents presented to the world. I called him back, stepping into Zoe's kitchen for privacy. Sophia, Jesus, I've been worried about you for months. How did you know something was wrong? Are you kidding? Every family gathering, you look like you're about to collapse from exhaustion while Isabella's showing off her latest shopping haul. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that something's not adding up. I found myself tearing up at the relief of being seen, of having someone acknowledge what I'd been living through. It's worse than you think. How much worse? I told him everything. The unemployment fraud, the disability scam, the years of working myself to death while my parents collected government assistance, the $200 weekly allowances for Isabella while I wore shoes with holes in them, the college dreams I'd abandoned to fund their lives. Dylan was quiet for a long time after I finished talking. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with anger. Those bastards. I knew something was wrong, but I never imagined it was that bad. I don't know what to do now. You did the right thing by leaving. But Sophia, you need to report them. The words sent a jolt of fear through me. Reporting them felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross, like declaring war on people who'd raised me despite everything they'd put me through. I can't turn in my own family. They're not acting like family. They're acting like criminals who happen to share your DNA. But what happens to Isabella? She didn't choose any of this. Isabella is 15, not 5. She's old enough to understand consequences, and she's definitely old enough to get a part-time job and start contributing instead of just taking. Before I could respond, Zoe appeared in the kitchen doorway. Sophia, you might want to see this. She handed me her laptop, open to Facebook. On the screen was a post from Catherine's account, posted 20 minutes ago. Please pray for our family during this difficult time. Our eldest daughter has chosen to abandon us when we need her most. Sometimes the children you sacrifice everything for turn their backs on you when life gets hard. Heartbroken doesn't begin to describe how we feel. The post already had dozens of comments, sympathetic neighbors offering prayers and support, friends of Catherine's expressing shock and disappointment, people I'd known my entire life, now seeing me as the villain in a story carefully crafted to make my parents look like victims. She posted this 20 minutes after I left the house, I said, my voice hollow with disbelief. Dylan's voice crackled through the phone speaker. What happened? I read him the post, feeling anger and hurt warring in my chest. They're not even waiting to see if I'll come back. They're already controlling the narrative, making sure everyone knows I'm the bad guy. Screenshot that, Dylan said immediately. Screenshot it and save it. That's evidence of their manipulation tactics. Zoe was already taking screenshots, her face grim with concentration. Look at the comments. Mrs. Patterson from down the street. I always thought that girl was ungrateful. Miss Collins from the hardware store. Kids these days have no respect for their parents. Each comment felt like a physical blow. These were people who'd known me since I was a child, who'd watched me grow up in their community. None of them knew the truth about what I'd been living through, but they were ready to condemn me based on my mother's carefully worded social media post. This is character assassination, Dylan said. They're trying to destroy your reputation before you have a chance to tell your side of the story. My side of the story makes them look like criminals. Because they are criminals, I handed the laptop back to Zoe and returned to the living room, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation and the escape was wearing off, leaving me feeling empty and uncertain. Outside the windows, Millbrook streets were quiet and dark, most of the town already asleep. I need to think about this, I said when Dylan asked again about reporting the fraud. I need to figure out what I'm doing before I make any decisions that can't be undone. Just promise me you won't go back to that house tonight. I'm not going back. Good. And Sophia, whatever you decide to do, you have support. You're not alone in this. After I hung up, Zoe and I sat in silence for a while, the weight of the evening settling around us like a heavy blanket. My phone continued to buzz periodically, more texts from Isabella, a few voicemails from Marcus that I didn't listen to, and notifications that people were commenting on Catherine's Facebook post. You should probably turn that off, Zoe suggested. Give yourself some peace tonight. I powered down the phone and set it aside, grateful for the sudden quiet. For the first time in hours, I could hear my own thoughts without the constant intrusion of my family's demands and manipulations. How long have you known?
Zoe asked. About the fraud, I mean. I suspected something was wrong for months, but I only confirmed it yesterday, seeing it all laid out on the government websites, the unemployment benefits, the disability payments, the timeline of it all. It made everything click into place. And you never said anything before because I was afraid, because I was tired, because I'd been conditioned to believe that questioning them was disrespectful and ungrateful. I paused, trying to find the right words, because it's easier to be a victim than to admit you're being victimized by people who claim to love you.
Zoe nodded like she understood. Even though her family situation was nothing like mine, her parents were divorced but functional, working people who supported their children without exploiting them. She'd never had to choose between her education and her family's electric bill. Never had to work herself to exhaustion while watching someone else reap the benefits. "What's the hardest part?" she asked. I thought about it for a moment. The hardest part is that I still love them. Even knowing what they've done, even understanding how they've manipulated and exploited me, I still care about what happens to them, and that makes me feel weak and stupid. It doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. Human is expensive when your family are criminals. Around midnight, Zoe made up the couch for me with blankets and pillows that smelled like fabric softener and safety. I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of downtown Millbrook settling into quiet. Somewhere across town, my family was probably having crisis meetings about how to replace my income and labor. Isabella was probably crying about her dance classes. Marcus was probably drinking and cursing my ingratitude. Catherine was probably crafting more social media posts designed to paint me as the villain in their victim narrative. For the first time in 2 years, none of that was my problem to solve. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed about college acceptance letters and scholarship awards, about a future where my labor benefited my own goals rather than funding someone else's fraud. I dreamed about walking across a graduation stage while my parents watched from the audience, proud of what I'd accomplished rather than resentful of what I couldn't provide. I dreamed about normal family dinners where money wasn't discussed, where love wasn't conditional on financial contribution, where teenagers got to be teenagers instead of unpaid employees. I woke up the next morning with sunlight streaming through Zoe's windows and the smell of coffee drifting up from the cafe downstairs. For a moment, I forgot where I was and why I was there. Then reality crashed back, the confrontation, the fraud, the threats, the social media assassination attempt. But alongside the memories of everything that had gone wrong, there was something new. For the first time in 2 years, I'd woken up without immediately calculating how much money I needed to earn that day, without mentally reviewing which bills were due and which family crisis would require my intervention. I'd woken up free. My phone showed 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. I scrolled through them while Zoe made breakfast, cataloging the escalating desperation in my family's communications. Isabella's messages started pleading, and gradually became accusatory. Catherine's began with fake sweetness and evolved into guilt-laden manipulation. Marcus's were consistently threatening, each one a little more specific about the consequences I would face if I didn't return home immediately. But there were other messages too. Dylan checking in to make sure I was safe. Mrs. Kowalski from the bakery asking if I was planning to come to work. Even a few classmates from high school who'd apparently seen Catherine's Facebook post and wanted to hear my side of the story. Popular girl, Zoe observed, watching me scroll through the notifications. Popular target, I corrected. So what's the plan for today? I looked at her, this friend who'd opened her home to me without question, who'd listened to my story without judgment, who'd stood by me when my own family had made me the enemy. The plan was simple, even if executing it would be complicated. Today I start building a life that's actually mine, I said. And your family? I thought about Catherine's Facebook post, about the community members who were ready to condemn me without knowing the truth, about Isabella's tears and Marcus's threats, and the comfortable lies they'd all been living at my expense. Today they start learning what their choices actually cost. The morning shift at Sunrise Bakery felt different with purpose, driving my movements instead of desperation. Mrs. Kowalski had been understanding when I'd called to explain that my living situation had changed, though I'd kept the details vague. She'd simply nodded and told me that my next paycheck would go directly to me rather than being part of any family arrangement. 3 days had passed since I'd walked out of the house on Maple Street. 3 days of sleeping on Zoe's couch, of fielding increasingly frantic calls from my family, of watching Catherine's Facebook post accumulate sympathetic comments from people who had no idea what they were actually supporting. 3 days of freedom that felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating. I was restocking the display case with fresh muffins when the bell chimed and Dylan walked through the door. He looked exhausted, like he'd driven straight through from Pittsburgh without stopping, which he probably had. "Heard you could use some backup," he said, settling onto one of the stools at the counter. "You didn't have to drive all the way here." "Actually, I did. I've been thinking about this situation for 3 days straight, and I realized something important." He accepted the coffee I poured him and leaned forward conspiratorially. "You're not the first person Marcus and Catherine have done this to." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "My mom, Marcus's sister. She told me some things after I called her about your situation. Apparently, this is a pattern. When Marcus was younger, he convinced his elderly father to let him handle the old man's finances. Guess what happened to Grandpa's savings account? The implications hit me like cold water. They've done this before. Multiple times in different ways. Catherine convinced her own mother to co-sign for a car loan that Catherine never paid. Marcus borrowed money from 3 different relatives for emergencies that never got repaid. You're not their first victim, Sophia. You're just their most successful one." Miss Kowalski emerged from the back room carrying a tray of fresh bread. But she paused when she saw Dylan's serious expression and my pale face. Small-town business owners had excellent instincts for when important conversations were happening in their establishments. "Everything all right out here?" she asked. Dylan glanced at me, raising an eyebrow. I'd been keeping my situation private, but something about his presence made me feel braver, more ready to let trusted people know what was really happening. "Mrs. Kowalski, can I ask you something? Hypothetically, if someone discovered that their family was committing fraud while forcing them to work to support the fraud, what would you advise that person to do?" She set down the bread tray with more force than necessary. "Hypothetically, I'd advise that person to document everything, report the fraud to the appropriate authorities, and get as far away from those criminals as possible." She paused, studying my face. "Hypothetically, even if those criminals were the person's parents, especially if they were the person's parents. Parents are supposed to protect their children, not exploit them." Dylan pulled out his phone and showed me the screen. "I've been doing some research. Pennsylvania has anonymous fraud reporting hotlines for both unemployment fraud and disability fraud. The penalties are serious. We're talking fines, restitution, and possible jail time." The idea of my parents in jail made my stomach clench, even though I knew they deserved whatever consequences their actions brought. "What about Isabella? If they get arrested, what happens to her?" "Isabella is 15, she'll either learn to take care of herself or she'll go live with relatives who actually have jobs. Either way, it's not your responsibility to sacrifice your future to prevent her from experiencing consequences." My phone buzzed against the counter. Another call from Mark. I'd stopped answering their calls yesterday, but they kept trying. The voicemails had evolved from threats to pleading to anger and back to threats again. "You should probably listen to that," Dylan said. "Document everything they're saying." I played the voicemail on speaker, keeping the volume low enough that customers wouldn't overhear. Marcus's voice was slurred, probably from drinking, and angrier than I'd ever heard it. "Sophia, I know you think you're being smart, but you're destroying this family. Isabella hasn't stopped crying since you left. Your mother is having panic attacks, and for what? Because you're too selfish to help the people who raised you. You come home right now, or I swear to God you'll regret this for the rest of your life. We know where you work. We know where your little friend lives. Don't think you can hide from your responsibilities forever." The threat was unmistakable. Mrs. Kowalski's face darkened, and Dylan's jaw tightened. "That's harassment," Dylan said, "and possibly intimidation. Save that voicemail. He's desperate," Miss Kowalski added. "People don't make threats like that unless they're panicking about something." As if summoned by our conversation, the bell chimed again, and Catherine walked through the door. She looked terrible, hair unwashed, makeup smeared, clothes wrinkled like she'd slept in them. Her eyes were red-rimmed and wild, scanning the bakery until they landed on me behind the counter. "There you are," she said, her voice pitched too high and too loud. "Do you have any idea what you've done to this family?" Miss Kowalski stepped forward, positioning herself between Catherine and the counter. "Ma'am, this is a place of business. If you're not here to buy something, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Catherine ignored her, focusing entirely on me. "Isabella is devastated. She had to quit her dance classes because we can't afford them without your help. She's humiliated at school, asking me why her sister abandoned her. Isabella had to quit her dance classes because her parents are committing fraud instead of working," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "How dare you accuse us of—" "I have documentation," I interrupted. "Government websites showing 2 years of fraudulent unemployment and disability claims, bank records showing that I've been paying bills that should have been covered by your illegal benefit, tax records proving that you've been lying to federal agencies while forcing me to work 60 hours a week." Catherine's face went white, then flushed red. "You don't understand the complexities of our financial situation. I understand fraud. We're your parent. We gave you life. We raised you. We loved you." Dylan stood up from his stool, all 6 feet of him radiating quiet menace. "You exploited her. You stole her childhood, her education, and her future to fund your criminal lifestyle. That's not love. That's abuse." Catherine finally seemed to notice that I wasn't alone, her eyes darting between Dylan and Mrs. Kowalski with growing panic. She was outnumbered and off her turf, no longer able to control the narrative or manipulate the situation. "Sophia, please," she said, her voice breaking. "Come home. We can fix this. We can be a real family again." "We were never a real family," I said. "Real families don't commit crimes. Real families don't sacrifice one child's future to fund another child's luxuries. Real families don't threaten and intimidate when they lose their victim." "I don't know what you mean about threats." Dylan held up his phone, where Marcus's voicemail was still loaded. "Would you like to hear your husband threatening your daughter and her friend?" Catherine's composure cracked completely. "You don't understand. If you report us, we'll lose everything. Isabella will have nothing. Isabella will have what she earns," I said. Like everyone else, Mrs. Kowalski had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm and understanding. Now she stepped forward again, her voice firm with authority. "Ma'am, you need to leave my establishment right now, or I'm calling the police. You can't keep her from her family." "Actually, I can. Sophia is an employee and a customer, and you're disrupting my business with threats and harassment. Leave now." Catherine looked between all of us, seeming to realize that she had no allies here, no one who would support her version of events or help her regain control of me. Her careful facade of victimhood was crumbling in the face of people who could see through her manipulation. "This isn't over," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," I replied. After she left, the bakery felt lighter somehow, as if her toxic presence had been actively poisoning the air. Mrs. Kowalski poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down heavily on one of the stools. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. 2 years of the fraud. My whole life for the emotional manipulation. And you've been working here the entire time, never complaining, never asking for help." I nodded. I didn't know I was allowed to ask for help. Dylan pulled out his laptop and opened it on the counter. "Okay, enough is enough. We're filing those fraud reports right now, while you have witnesses, and before they try anything else." "I'm scared," I admitted. "Of what?" "Of them getting arrested. Of Isabella hating me forever. Of the whole town turning against me." Mrs. Kowalski reached across the counter and covered my hand with hers. "Honey, let me tell you something I learned from 30 years of running a business in a small town. The people who matter will see the truth. The people who don't see the truth don't matter." Dylan turned his laptop screen toward me. "Pennsylvania Unemployment Fraud Reporting Form. It takes 10 minutes to fill out, and it's completely anonymous if you want it to." I stared at the screen, knowing that clicking submit would change everything irrevocably. My parents would face investigation, possible criminal charges, definitely financial consequences. Isabella would have to learn to live in the real world. The comfortable lies that had held our family together would be exposed. but those lies had been destroying me piece by piece for 2 years. The comfort they provided my family had cost me my education, my health, my future, and nearly my sanity. "Will you help me fill it out?" I asked Dylan. "Absolutely." It took longer than 10 minutes because I had so much documentation to upload. Bank statements showing my financial contributions to the household, screenshots of the government websites showing their fraudulent claims, photos of Isabella's expensive purchases funded by my labor, even the voicemail where Marcus had threatened me. When we reached the section asking for additional information, I paused. What should I say here? Dylan thought for a moment. Tell them about the pattern, about Isabella's allowance while you worked 60 hours a week, about being forced to drop out of school, about the other family members they've scammed. Make them understand that this isn't just financial fraud, it's systematic exploitation. I typed for several minutes, laying out 2 years of abuse and manipulation in clinical factual language. When I finished, Dylan read it over and nodded approvingly. That's a solid case. They'll have to investigate, and with the documentation you've provided, it's pretty much airtight. My finger hovered over the submit button. Once I clicked it, there would be no going back. My parents would face the consequences of their actions, and I would have to live with being the person who turned them in, but I was already living with being the person they'd exploited and abused. At least this way, it would stop. I clicked submit. The confirmation page appeared almost immediately. Your report has been received and assigned case number, PAUS. They can't hurt you anymore. Mrs. Kowalski squeezed my hand. You did the right thing, honey. It took courage, but you did the right thing. Over the following weeks, the investigation moved quickly. A fraud investigator contacted me within 48 hours, asking for additional documentation and clarification. I provided everything I had, answered every question honestly, and signed statements detailing the extent of my financial contributions to the household. Isabella texted me constantly at first, alternating between begging me to come home and cursing me for destroying the family. But as the reality of their situation set in, no more unemployment benefits, no more disability payments, no more free labor to cover their expenses, her messages grew shorter and less frequent. Marcus and Catherine were charged with multiple counts of fraud. They pled guilty to avoid jail time, but they faced significant fines and restitution payments. More importantly, they had to get jobs, with real responsibilities, and real consequences for not showing up. Isabella, faced with the choice between learning to contribute or going to live with relatives in Pittsburgh, chose to stay in Millbrook and get a part-time job at the grocery store. Dylan reported that she'd actually become more pleasant to be around once she started earning her own money and understanding the value of work. I stayed with Zoe for 2 months while I saved money for my own apartment. Mrs. Kowalski promoted me to assistant manager at the bakery and helped me apply for night classes at the community college. I was behind where I should have been, educationally, but I was moving forward instead of being held back. The town's opinion of me shifted gradually as the truth came out. Some people still believed my parents' version of events, but enough people understood what had really happened that I stopped feeling like a pariah. Mrs. Thompson from down the street even apologized for believing Catherine's Facebook post without knowing the full story. 6 months after I'd walked out of the house on Maple Street, I walked across the stage at Millbrook Community College to receive my high school equivalency diploma. In the audience, Zoe cheered loudly enough to embarrass both of us. Dylan had driven down from Pittsburgh with his parents, who'd become unexpected sources of support once they learned what Marcus and Catherine had been doing. Mrs. Kowalski had closed the bakery early to attend, sitting in the front row with tears in her eyes, as I accepted my diploma. Even some of my former teachers were there, the ones who remembered the bright student I'd been before I'd been forced to choose between education and survival. My parents weren't there. Isabella wasn't there. But for the first time in my life, I didn't need their approval or presence to feel proud of my accomplishments. After the ceremony, I stood outside the community college, looking up at the clear Pennsylvania sky. Fall was turning to winter, the air crisp with the promise of snow and new beginning. In my hand, I held a diploma that represented not just academic achievement, but freedom from a system that had nearly destroyed me. Dylan appeared beside me,
Grinning, so what's next? I thought about the college applications I'd been working on, the scholarships I'd applied for, the future I was finally free to build. Everything, I said. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to be a victim anymore. Sometimes saving yourself requires walking away from people who claim to love you, but treat you like a resource to be exploited. Sometimes the family you build is stronger than the family you're born into. And sometimes when you stop enabling other people's dysfunction, you discover that you're capable of far more than you ever imagined. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.